So we are recording this presentation tonight. I'd like to just remind everyone to please keep yourself muted throughout the presentations. We will be ending the workshop this evening with a question and answer period. So if you have any questions come up throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat as they come to mind, or you can hold on to them and they'll be answered at the end of the presentations. Next slide. I'm going to start by giving us just a quick overview of what we intend to cover tonight so that everyone makes sure that they're in the right place and knows what we're here to learn about. So I'll be kicking us off with a brief overview of the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation and our Forest Futures Initiative. Then Susie Kocher, who's joined us from a UC Research Forest this evening, will be presenting on forest management plans and why you may consider developing one for your property. Following Susie's presentation, Alessandra Zambrano will be teaching us about CEQA environmental compliance. And then I'll share a short list of resources that property owners can utilize for your specific needs or to advise others. And then we'll roll into some questions and answers with our presenters. This workshop is slated to go through 5:30. So if we don't answer everyone's questions before then, we'll take record of them and follow up with folks to make sure that there aren't any outstanding questions. So, as I promised, the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation has been serving our community since 1998. The foundation connects people and opportunities, generating resources to build a more caring, creative, and effective community. We pride ourselves in connecting donors to causes that they love, supporting nonprofits through grants, training, and connecting community leaders to collaborate on strategy. Beyond grant making and scholarships, TTCF has identified 3 critical issues unique to our community: family strengthening, workforce housing, and forest health. Our initiative focused on forest health, Forest Futures, is a strategic model for how community foundations across the country can take a lead role in confronting the local impacts of climate change. Forest Futures has been deploying capital towards forest health and wildfire resilience projects through 3 areas of impact: protect communities, build infrastructure for a forest economy, and accelerate market solutions. These impact areas play a role in addressing the wildfire threat to our community for the long haul. TTCF's general Forest Futures grants have gone to nonprofits and public agencies working on various forest health and wildfire resilience, aligned to these 3 impacts areas you see. We are proud to have raised $5.75 million to date and have released $3 million to 36 different projects in our region. After being approached by one of our local fire districts, they encouraged us to apply to a grant opportunity through CAL FIRE to bring more dollars into our community to support work in this protect communities category, but specifically for private landowners. So in June 2022, TTCF was awarded funding through a pilot program of CAL FIRE's, the Wildfire Resilience Block Grant Program, to begin developing the Truckee North Tahoe Forest Management Program. Next slide. So the Truckee North Tahoe Forest Management Program, or sometimes called the TNTFMP because everyone loves a good acronym, is a competitive grant application process open to eligible private property owners for 2 paths of funding assistance. One path is for technical assistance, so funding to hire a registered professional forester to either develop a forest management plan for one's property or to go through the CEQA environmental compliance process. The other path is to implement projects, and that is what resource professionals like to call shovel-ready projects, meaning that they have projects or they have CEQA environmental compliance already in place. And so they're ready to have machinery and or crews get to work on the ground. I've included the dates here for the next application round, which you can read more about online, and we'll have additional information about that in our follow-up email. However, those 2 application paths are really what have brought us here today to inform the content for this workshop. So in talking with property owners in the last year, as the TNTFMP launched its first application round, we've seen a strong need for this technical assistance side of things to really understand why forest management plans are needed and to understand when the CEQA environmental compliance process is needed. We know we won't be able to support everyone in our community who would like to accomplish this kind of work with a grant through the TNTFMP. So we are hopeful that these presentations this evening will give you information to be more informed, either while applying to our grant program or to give you more information on how you can pursue these options on your own and understand what resources exist out there that can support you in managing your forested land. Next slide. So with that, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers this afternoon and then turn it over to them. So our first speaker, as I noted already, is Susie Kocher. Susie is with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and she's a registered professional forester, and she's been an extension forester in the Central Sierra since 2006. She holds her BA in anthropology from the University of Iowa and her MS in forestry from the University of Washington. Susie is personally based in South Lake Tahoe, so she is familiar with our particular region. Our second presenter this evening, who will be speaking about CEQA and the California Environmental Quality Act, that is abbreviated as CEQA, is Alessandra Zambrano. She is the Nevada County Wildfire Coordinator, and she holds her bachelor's degree in environmental management and a master's in forestry specializing in fire behavior modeling. She's based in Truckee, but works across all of Nevada County as she works for the Nevada County Office of Emergency Services. So Susie, with that, I'll turn it over to you. And as I noted, Susie is calling in from one of the UC Research Forest stations. So we're going to be working with a little bit of delayed time on slides potentially, but we'll see how it goes. And Susie, I'll turn it over to you.
I just want to mention one more thing, and Susie, before you get started, if for some reason the slides drop off, I drop off, or Anne drops off, I just want to encourage everyone to stay on the call while we reconnect, because we have other ways of getting back on with internet issues. So go ahead, Susie.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. I'm at the Blodgett Research Forest in El Dorado County. We have a week-long work retreat. So if you're ever here, the internet password is very little bandwidth, exclamation point. So that's why they're running my slides. I'm on the phone, so even if I drop off the actual Zoom call, I should be able to keep going. But I may not always see what I'm presenting. I'm going to rely on you all to forward one. So thank you so much for having me. And I've met Anne through our Forest Stewardship Workshop series. I am a registered professional forester, and I am doing work statewide, doing outreach and education to private forest landowners. We have a program that's funded by CAL FIRE, in which we do a 9-week course all about forest management plans and field days to teach them forest and mapping skills. So I wanted to give a shout out to Andrea, who I saw was on the phone, who used to be on our steering committee. I see a couple of other RPFs I know, so thank you so much for being involved with this process, and everyone there who is working hard to landowners. So let's go to the next slide. So I just wanted to start very quickly with a little bit of information about forest land ownership in California, so that private forest landowners can position themselves within this whole space of forest management and who owns what. On the left, you'll see a map of different forest types, and you might be able to see my cursor here. Obviously, we're up here, mostly conifer, some east side systems over here. Oh, thank you. You're my cursor for me. I appreciate that. As far as who owns what, in California, we have about 32 million acres of forest, and of that, around 20 million acres are publicly owned, and 12 are owned by private landowners. 5 million are owned by industrial timber companies like Pacific Industries or redwood companies over on the coast. And then 7 million acres are owned by individuals, family forests. The jargony word is non-industrial forest landowners, but basically just small private landowners. So there's about 7 million acres owned by folks like you, and 90% of you own less than 50 acres. There's a large need for helping folks in this category move forward on their forest management plans and provide technical assistance. So I'm very happy to see the foundation moving forward to try and help this particular audience, because private landowners are very important in our forest resilience plans for the future. there's about 75,000 private landowners who have, no, that's good, go ahead and go forward, have 10 acres or more. So you can see it's a very large audience of people who really need assistance, for the most part, moving through a forest management process. So just really quickly, I think that people have understood more and more as we've had very intense wildfire seasons that fire needs to be part of our landscape again. Our forests evolved with frequent fire, both natural and human caused. California Indians were and continued to manage the landscape with prescribed fire. A lot of those practices in the Sierra were intact until around the 1849 gold rush. There was a lot of displacement, genocide of Native communities. This is a series of books if you're interested in understanding more about how Native people managed the landscape and what happened when they were removed. Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. Forgotten Fires is that same story across the country. And then this American Genocide book just came out in 2017, documents. Just very difficult to read, but very important. So next slide, please. So we all know that there's been a whole period without fire on the landscape. There on the left, you see a tree cookie with fire scars. So if you look at each one of those arrows, what it's pointing at is a fire scar. So a small fire, not a big fire, went by and damaged the tree, but not so much as to kill it. So these are low severity fires, and they can be dated. So you see 18.
Sorry, Susie, I accidentally muted you while trying to mute someone else in the meeting.
That's okay, I'm back. All right, so I was explaining my, my tree cookie there. So on the right, you see a picture of some white fir under some pines burning. That was the first prescribed fire I ever did. There's a little bit of fuel. It might affect some of those trees around it, but probably not. And if it does, it might just leave a little scar. That's the kind of fire that leaves a scar there on the left. Those wide arrows are pointing at fire scars. So a fire went by, it wounded the bark, and the tree recovered, and you can see a scar for each fire that went by. So you see arrows at 1802, 1810, that's 8 years, 1810 to 1816, that's 6 years. If you average those together, you would see 7 years, and you would call that a fire return interval of 7 years. So we can look in a lot of the forests. We have really great data that shows us how frequent fires used to be in the past. So we know that they were very common by reading these tree rings and some of the ethnographic interviews as well. So without that fire, there's all sorts of things that happen. The trees take over, they get thicker, you displace understory plants, shrubs, riparian areas, mountain meadows. And the other big effects that we're feeling the impacts of now with so many fires is the huge buildup in forest fuels and increased stress on individual trees because there's water that might have a carrying capacity from moisture, precipitation. If it's instead of only watering 3 trees, it's watering 20 trees. Each tree gets less water, and so it has more stress to complete its physiological. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is from the Lake Tahoe watershed assessment that was done in 2000. This is an estimate of the fire return interval around the Lake Tahoe basin. So that white color around the lake says every 5 to 15 years in general, fires went through, cleaned out the understory, burned up some fuels. As you can see on the west shore, it goes up to very infrequent very quickly, and that's the higher elevation and granite outcroppings. The higher up you go, the less material there is. It takes longer for more stuff to grow back and carry a fire, and there's fewer burn days because it's more moist, more time of the year. But that 5 to 18 around the basin is pretty frequent, and we have had nothing like that for quite a long time. So next slide, please. Here's a photo series from George Gruhl. He wrote a book called Fire in the Sierra Nevada. And so in addition to removing folks who were using prescribed fire, we really started to suppress wildfires everywhere around 1910. And so without that frequent fire, what we had was a big infilling of conifers. So there we are right in Nevada County. On the left, that is the kind of density that was produced by a frequent fire regime that's never been logged. That is density managed by fire. And on the right, after the fire stopped, that is what grew in. And so it's much denser and there's less resilience to drought and wildfire with a dense, overly stocked. So next page, next slide, please. Okay, so we know that fires are becoming more severe and bigger. So that first little graph on the left is the numbers of acres burned in the Sierra Nevada region since 1920. And across the state in 2020, we had about 4 million acres burned. California has 100 million acres. So that's around around 4% of the state burned in just 1 year. Now, that's pretty common to what we think was the estimate of how much burned before fire suppression. 4 to 12% we think burned average on every year. However, when it's burning that frequently, the impacts are low. But now that it's burning very infrequently, we have many more fuels on the ground and dense trees, and so the impacts are here. So right underneath there, you have a little table that's from a paper by Williams et al. That came out this year. It showed, they did an analysis of what percent of a fire footprint throughout the state burned at high severity. And so high severity means it kills almost all the trees. Low severity is the fire I was showing you in the earlier slides where it might kill a few, but in general, it's doing good work by reducing fuels and density. So before 1850, in an average fire footprint, less than 7% would be a patch where everything burned and was killed. And now between 2010 and 2020, we're up to 36%. So it's a drastic increase in the amount of trees that are killed in wildfires because of these changing conditions. So next slide, please. Oh, and that's the fires around our area. Obviously, the Caldor fire. Yeah, that's fine. You guys have been living through them if you long. We also have climate change coming in as a factor in fire and tree health. So in addition to this change in forest structure due to fire suppression, we are having increasing temperature over time. 2012 to 16 was a really warm drought, and we'd had droughts before. It wasn't the biggest loss of water, but it was a large loss of water while it's getting warmer. And plants in general, when it's warmer, need more water, not less, so you can have much more severe impacts because that drought was warmer. Right, so those slides are from the central southern Sierra. We saw just a big die-off very quickly, 150 million trees. Probably we've removed about 1% of those from the land. We're going to hit infrastructure. There's now a lot of dead trees out on the landscape, which increases the fuel load. And importantly, dead trees that are stressed are less likely to fight off attack by native bark. All along the west shore, and they're going down Highway 80, you can see a lot of firs really dying off over time. The pines, after the big moisture year of 2017, stopped dying, but the firs have just continued to die slowly over time, just from stress and from years of drought before our big winter this year. Next slide, please. There's a lot of issues managed in our forests, and so private landowners are really important to try, and most of the people I work with really want to reduce their fire and insect outbreak risk. How can they do that? Basically, the key, obviously we can't control moisture. The best things we can do are to reduce the fuels on the ground and reduce the tree density. So to be able to do that, you need to manage the vegetation, reduce your hazards. So these are just some of the techniques that are being used across the state, sorry. Hand thinning and pile burning, mastication, which is that machine at the top that can go in and grind up material and remove it to the forest floor, change its behavior during fires, grazing, thinning with mechanical equipment that can take small material out of the woods, chipping, and piling and burning, and broadcast burning. All of those are excellent techniques and have their place. Some of them are difficult to pull off due to constraints, especially with the market. There's not a real good market these days selling anything. And then the point is that doing all this work is much easier if you actually have a vegetation management. That's fine. Next slide. So a plan is a document that helps you think through what it is that is your goal, what you're going to do to achieve your goal, and then maybe how you might schedule it. I am speaking to you after I think I said this workshop series. We got funded in 2020. And we've had 24 cohorts of students and about 500 people go through it. Anne is in our current cohort in Santa Cruz, Santa Clara. And so we have talked with landowners all over the state. We have some in San Bernardino. We've been all the way to San Diego, up to Siskiyou, Humboldt. And we ask all of our folks to take a survey and tell us what their issues are. So I wanted to spend a little time describing to you, in my experience, what forest landowners' issues and goals are. Possibly you can see yourself in there. As a private landowner, you are part of a much larger community of people who have oftentimes similar. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a little pie chart that shows how people own their forest land. In a pie chart, you start at the upper right-hand corner. That matches with the legend. So 19% in yellow are joint owners with a partner, 17% in a trust. You can see 14% owned individually, families, and others. So we have a lot of other people take our work, are interested in private landowner issues on land. So next slide, please. They tell us mostly they have purchased that land, 56% individually, about 17 have inherited or received it as a gift, 3%, or others. Those are some of the folks who don't own land. Or we ask them if they live on their property. You can see yes is in red, about 59% have a residence near their land, 41% own it, but don't have a residence there, so obviously are part-time. And only about half of them have ever received any information about how to manage their land, which I think is an issue that we're trying to address through our workshop series and these types of assistance. Only 14% had ever used a cost share program like the foundation is offering you, and 9% had some kind of. Next slide. We asked them, these are all questions that we based on the National Woodland Owner Survey, which is a survey that's administered by the Forest Service across the country. We use their questions, but we have our own set of data from the folks that we've. You can see, let's talk about this slide. So on the left, in light blue, are people who strongly agree with a statement, and then agree is orange. So if I add that together, that comes up to 93% say they agree or strongly agree that they want their wooded land to stay wooded. They're very emotionally attached to their landscape and really feel it's important to keep it as a forest. 5% want to know more about their land. That's why they should stop. Hard to do math quick in my. 88% believe that their wooded land provides benefits to their community, not just for their own benefit. And there's 87% who say they have a strong emotional attachment. Only on the bottom one, only somewhere around 69% strongly or disagree or strongly disagree that they would sell their land right now. You can really see that the people that we work with are really attached and want to do the best for their forest. So next slide, please. How many are likely to sell it? 62% are extremely unlikely, and 23% they want to stay there. Okay, so we ask people, why do you own forest land? What is it that you get out of it? And so you can see at the top, very important and important. That's the blue and the orange together. 97% say enjoying the beauty or scenery is important or very important. This is really consistent across the state. It doesn't matter where we go. Everyone says it's really about the amenity values of my forest. I want to protect biological diversity, improve habitat, protect water resources. Those are always the top numbers there. There's this next section here, which is to pass on land to their children, which is also ranks very high across the state. So if I add orange and blue, I have, let's see, 62% think that one of their main goals is to figure out how to pass their land on to the next generation and privacy and raise their family there. So after that, then you see the next set are a little bit more utilitarian. So recreation is the highest one. Investment is a reason for people, but then these products, firewood, forest products, timber ranks fairly low, as does hunting. Doesn't mean that it wouldn't be something that landowners would do once or twice in their lifetime if they could, but it's just not a major reason. So most people out there on the landscape are really wanting to maintain their forest for personal and enjoyment, as well as the good of the. Okay, so what are they worried about? Well, it's pretty obvious, and they are worried about wildfires. So blue and orange is great concern and concern. So wildfire is at the top of everybody's mind, pretty much. And then next actually ranks keeping their land intact for future generations. Legacy. Climate change, drought, insects and disease, and invasive plants are pretty much round up those top. The rest of these are also from the National Woodland Owner Survey, so maybe wind or ice storms isn't high on our list, but it might be in the south where they have hurricanes and that sort of thing. So you can see people are really concerned about these pressing issues daily around them. Okay, we asked them what they've actually done. About 75% say they have reduced fire hazards on their own. Over half have done something to eliminate invasive plants. They have cut trees for their own use. They've done road construction and trail maintenance, collected some forest products, a few, 23% wildlife habitat, and then 16% grazing. Cutting or removing trees for sale or a commercial type of activity, it's about 10% of the.
And
I
can
am
you
not
hear?
able. I am not able to hear Susie anymore. Susie, can you hear us
Oh,
either
well,
through your phone? Oh, you're back.
I hear you.
Okay.
I'm
Great.
hear you. I said next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think some of you may have recognized yourself in there as far as the issues that you're dealing with. So my advice to landowners through our workshop series is really that developing a forest management plan can be an important next step to actually trying to reduce your risks for wildfire or advance some of the other goals that you might have. And so our workshop series, we are funded to help people work through the California Cooperative Forest Management Plan. So that's the CEQA. There's my acronym that I'm going to use. It is a plan that has been developed cooperatively by the Forest Service, CAL FIRE, NRCS, and the American Tree Fire System. That's why it's called cooperative, because if you fill out this one plan template, it should be something accepted by all these different agencies for the potential of a cost share program. So it's not a harvesting document, doesn't meet the requirements of the forest practice. It is a plan that includes a lot of information, what you want to do and how you're going to do it. Next page, please. Who does a plan belong to? So if you write a forest management plan just for your own use, it just belongs to you. It doesn't require any other standards. And we do have landowners who are doing it for that reason. They want to communicate to the next generation, possibly, what they've done, why they've done it, what they think should be done. So a plan can be a great communication tool with the next generation or other people who you may own it with. Some people do have large families owning one piece of land. Writing a plan together can be a way to communicate what should happen there. If you are going to apply for a cost share program, then a plan often needs to be signed by a California registered professional forester. And if you're applying for these different cost share programs, it needs to be by agency representative. Okay, don't want to freak you out. Look, it's really 29 pages blank. So I wanted to just cover a little bit about what's in a plan without a whole lot of detail, just to show you what it is. Things that are in bold are the parts that we encourage landowners to fill out themselves. Find one of these templates online and you can start writing some of it yourself so that you have information to communicate, especially if you're working with a professional to help you write a plan. So we're going to zoom through these next few slides because I don't want to bog anyone down in detail, but I want to maybe say a few words about each one. So here's a whole page that's just landowner information and management, whether or not there's a current management. If you purchase the property from someone who had some kind of timber sale, there could be a plan already developed that would help you moving forward. These are facts we think most landowners could fill out in the CEQA, some description of your location, GPS coordinates, scope of your land, how much road system you have. Some things are more technical, like Cal Water, so we just encourage that, but fill out what they can. Next page. Property history is important for anybody who's going to help you manage your landscape. Have personal knowledge. Older generation, might they know what happened? Go to local libraries. You can pull up local agency documents. For example, the Lake Tahoe Watershed Assessment shows my neighborhood in Lake Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe, and exactly where the small gauge railroad was that did the logging in my region. So it's pretty cool. And since we all live pretty close to public lands, there should be a lot of documents available. Forest Service with all sorts of historical. If you don't have access to any of those, then things like stumps and skid roads, all those things, or there was a fire in your region, those are all just things that you would note under property. Infrastructure, pretty straightforward to discuss your improvements, structures, dwellings. Forest infrastructure. So this is an overall description of what your forest is like, trees per acre, types of species, silvicultural practices. So this is a little more technical, and generally a forester is going to fill out that part. Roads definitely are things you could describe. Culverts and crossings and whether or not they're sized right is a little more technical. I would skip that part. I couldn't tell you the answer. Access and security, are property boundaries surveyed? All that stuff should be stuff you would know. How do you use your property for recreation trails, that sort of thing? And what we tell our landowners is this is not a thesis or a dissertation. Like probably if you get to one paragraph, that's enough information. Working with a professional. A lot of this is more technical. I left in upland wildlife because a lot of people enjoy watching the wildlife on their property. I believe we're going to have a session with our stewardship workshop on wildlife cameras in January, helping people think about how to install wildlife cameras. But a lot of people already have those and they just love watching what's on their property. So if you're that person, this would be a pretty straightforward section to fill out. And air resources, are you doing pile burning or prescribed burning with unwanted vegetation? Next page. Page 16, landowner objectives. This is the most important part of the plan and the part that we really need landowners to weigh in on. Professional can't help you achieve your goals if you can't articulate your goals. And so it's really important to be able to say what it is you want on your property. Most of the landowners I work with want to increase fire resilience, their fire health. A lot of them want to increase wildlife habitat, but there may be other goals. You want to set up recreation trails. Maybe you want to have some kind of income. Maybe you want to have a glamping site. Maybe you want to fuels. All those things are things that you would want to articulate as your management objective. Next page. Here are some of the goals that we suggest that landowners could use and that you could use to put in your plan. We work with landowners across the state, obviously, so oak woodlands are a big issue for people in other parts of the state. You may want to favor certain tree species. Here it would probably be pines over a lot of firs or cedars. Maybe you want to build recreational trails, that sort of thing. You just need to really articulate those so that you can work with a professional to make.
I've lost Susie's audio again. Susie, are you able to hear us?
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here. I said next slide, please. Okay. So this whole next section is on how you would like the future to look. What would you like to do in different parts of your property? Fencing, soils, all that. Let's go to the next slide. So we're getting more and more technical in requirements, like maybe you want salmon, but you're not in a salmon place, so maybe that would not be appropriate. This would be something that you would want to consult with a professional to help you really identify what is possible in your location. Next slide. A plan has a a description of different parts of the property carved up into units. So you may have a unit around your house that you treat more intensively for fire resilience and then more heavily than you do a unit farther away. You have a larger property, you could have density in your forest there. That would be less of a risk. So you're going to have descriptions of different parts of the property and their condition. And then there's a management plan. What kind of activities might be possible in the next 5 years? Area, what do you propose as a treatment? When could you start? How are you going to fund it? There's a page to describe permits. What kind of, do you have merchantable trees? Is there any way to sell anything off your property, in which case you would need a CAL? Or if there's not, then in which case you would need to go through a CEQA process for using agency funds. Next slide, please. Okay, I know the next speaker is going to talk a lot about CEQA, so I'm not really going to mention it too much right now. A forest management plan that we're writing here is not a CEQA process. Needs of the Forest Practices Act. Next page. Listing agencies. This is a good thing you could do. Figuring out who can help you in your region. That's one. And then a series of maps are required to go with a forest management plan. Location, the parcel, oil map, water resources, and roads, along with units and projects, all need to be on the maps with the plan. In our workshop series, we day of Avenza skill building, where we try and help people learn how to make maps. Some people have that expertise. There's a lot of ways now with cell phones that you can really learn more about mapping, and we are doing our workshop Saturday with the Santa Cruz group, where we're teaching people to use Avenza and map some parts of their property and share that with a professional. Next page. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Let's skip. But you can see there's a lot of. Do you have any past plans, any data? Yeah. Okay, let's look at this slide. So just searching online, there were a couple California Cooperative Forest Management Plans that were filled out and are just freely available online. So here is one. You can see under management goals and objectives, this landowner has timber production, aesthetics, wildlife protection, insects, trees, erosion, and oak woodland as their management goals. We have 2 paragraphs. This is someone obviously on the coast who would prefer their oak woodland not to be filled in with Douglas fir. And so they want to keep their oaks and take out the Douglas fir possibly for and paid for that through it. On the map, you saw some units that would be treated differently because of their location. They have different prescriptions about what's going to be done on the parts of a CCFMP. Next plan, next page. The one after this is a little more detailed. I found this one online, and they had just a lot. This was called their objectives, but it's actually really, really specific. It's almost what should actually happen with each stand. Goals around trees to have there, reducing stocking levels. Next slide, please. There you go. Treat invasive plants, construct shaded fuel breaks, provide for habitat. Next slide. So you can see what I was trying to tell you there is that there's options for how specific. You could be a lumper or a splitter, but generally that goal section is really important. And however you end up doing this work through a cost share program, through the foundation, on your own, DIY, or through some kind of income producing activity, it's just really important to keep those goals together and let that and the plan guide your management action. I just wanted to give a little bit of information about the Forest Practices Act. Talking with Ann and Nicole, I heard them talk a lot about CEQA, but not about the Forest Practices Act. So I just felt it was important to give just a little bit of overview about that. So any time that the any woody material is going to actually be sold, and I think you're covering up the slide there, Nicole.
I moved it. Is it still showing?
Now I see it. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. Anytime that you actually sell, barter, trade, or exchange any material from your forest property, you are required to have a permit from CAL FIRE as part of the Forest Practices Act. That doesn't mean you also need to do CEQA. If you commercialize anything on your property, that is functionally equivalent to CEQA. So there are a series of different permitting processes if there's any commercial material. Timber harvest plans are the largest, most expensive permit that you would want to get from CAL FIRE. There's a lot of assessment, there's a lot of wildlife surveys, and it can be costly and take a long time. But there's a whole series of exemptions that are much less complex and expensive. And those things can be done much more quickly. So up there on the right is this great little fact sheet from CAL FIRE. Do you need a CAL FIRE permit to move forward with your project? Is it on timberlands, which means it can grow timber? Yes. Is it on lands owned by particular people, not the feds or the tribes? Yes. Are you going to cut or remove trees to be sold or processed? Yes. Or are you going to convert the timberland? Then you would need some kind of harvest document. And if not, then you do not, right? One of the advantages of this doing work under the Forest Practices Act is that you can use RPFs to do the archaeological survey on your property. RPFs are trained and they can complete that for you. In a lot of places, there's a dearth of registered professional archaeologists, and it can be a bottleneck for someone. However, if there's no commercial component of your project, which I understand from Ann and Nicole is part of your process with your grant program, then you would use CEQA or NEPA. CEQA if it's a California funding source, or NEPA if it's a national funding source. It's because you're getting funding from the state or feds that you would need to use CEQA or NEPA. Now, if you were doing work on your own, if you want to go out with your chainsaw and thin out your forest and not use any state funding or federal funding for cost share, then you do not need CEQA or the Forest Practices Act. You may need permits if you're grading or doing other things, but not because you're cutting a tree. So I think that's a little complicated, and I'm happy if any of the RPFs on the on the call want to add in or write in the chat box any kind of caveats or anything that I said, but this is the general layout of the different permitting paths. Next slide, I think it's the last one. And this is just a table from CAL FIRE about some of those exemptions. So you go down in a column. So there's different exemptions for different types of projects. Some of them require a registered professional forester. Some of them don't. So structure protection, if you're doing work within 150 feet of your house and you can sell the logs, that's when the Forest Practices Act is triggered. You could get a CAL FIRE permit without an RPF, although it's always a good idea to have an RPF to give you good advice. But exemptions from the Forest Practices Act are from when you are having any kind of commercialization of your timber asset. And if there is no commercialization, then it's a different process. It's not the Forest Practices Act. It's which I think I know a lot less about, but our next speaker knows a whole bunch about. So next slide, if there is one, I think that was everything I wanted to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Susie. That was definitely a lot of information, but very helpful to distill a lot of the basic information around forest management plans and also see a lot of data from folks that you've worked with through your stewardship workshop series. I just want to note that we can send out a copy of a blank cooperative forest management plan for folks to just be able to read through and see those fill in the blank sections that Susie just walked us through, as well as I noted, we're recording this and can share out the slide deck as well if folks want to read in greater detail a lot of what Susie shared. But with that, I'll turn it over to Alessandra, who's here to take us into CEQA land.
All right, so I'm just going to provide an overview on what the CEQA process is and kind of give some background information as to why it applies in this particular program. Because based on, we had a lot of feedback with a TNTFMP program of people just not having a lot of questions about why CEQA applies. Why do we have to go through this whole process? Why are there so much red tape and so many hoops to jump through? And it's part of this landscape and it's part of what we have to sort of work through. I will just add as a caveat, I am not a CEQA expert, I would say. It's some people dedicate their entire lives to this field of expertise. I am very familiar with the process because I used to work in this industry. So I will do my best to my ability to provide you an overview, give you some insight as to the knowledge. I won't likely to be able to answer very, very project specific questions, but we do have lots of resources on where you can find more information as well that Anne will be sending out after the presentation. So CEQA was established in the 1970s and it stands for the California Environmental Quality Act. And it was actually based off of NEPA, which is the National Environmental Protection Act. And it really served to become the foundation of environmental law in California. So under CEQA, the main objectives are that you have to disclose any impacts your project could potentially have to the environment. You are required to try to reduce or avoid those environmental damages. It really creates a transparency process where now that kind of information is public facing. And it also created a mechanism that required agencies or applicants to have public participation in these processes. It also worked to foster intergovernment coordination so that people weren't being duplicative as they moved through these project permitting processes. So CEQA approval is a really important part of the process. And one thing that is important to understand is that CEQA approval and project approval are two different things. So in order to get CEQA approval, you need to demonstrate compliance with CEQA. Once you've done that, now your project can be considered for approval. And it's really important to note two things. You can't start working on your project until you've obtained CEQA approval and project approval. And anything that was documented in those documents, if there was a mitigation measure that was called out, it becomes legally binding once CEQA has been approved. So it is a legally binding document. So CEQA looks at the impacts to our environment, and it's very specific in the way in which it considers those impacts. It only considers how the physical environment is going to be altered by that project. And it looks at categories like land, air, water, etc. And there's quite a few in which it considers, and it's always from the perspective of how does the project modify the environment? And it looks at it both in a direct way, an indirect way, or cumulative level impacts. So a really important piece in this process is known as the lead agency. And you may have seen in the TNTFMP grant program documents is that you have to identify a lead agency if you're going through that implementation stream. And the reason is the lead agency is someone who is the person is essentially the agency who's either responsible for carrying out the project or is responsible for approving that project. They would be the person to issue the approval for the CEQA documentation, the person to issue the permit, and really decide if the project is going to occur or not. They also help determine the level of CEQA that would be required for that particular project. And generally, your lead agency is going to be the agency that has the greatest level of responsibility. So sometimes you have projects where you need multiple permits from different agencies, but one of those permits is going to be that go, no go, the most powerful permit. And generally, the one who holds that permit becomes your lead agency. One thing that's also important to note is that public agencies can be a lead for their own project, but private applicants cannot. They have to find a public partner to become their lead agency. So the CEQA applicant is the other side to that relationship. This is the person who's bringing the project to the agency for approval. And like I said, in this scenario, a private applicant cannot be their own lead agency. And it also means that private applicants have to provide the financing for the CEQA process. The lead agency does not pay for you to go through CEQA. You have to be able to bring those funds to the table as well. So this is what is sort of known as the CEQA roadmap, and this is a really distilled version of the CEQA roadmap, which gives you an idea of how complex this process can be. So we're just going to move through this roadmap, and I'm going to kind of explain what each one of these little stops are, because a really important relationship or question happens at one of these stops. So in this scenario, an application has been proposed and it's been brought to the lead agency. The first thing that lead agency is going to try to determine is this a project under CEQA or not? If it isn't a project under CEQA, then no further action is required and you can get your permit and move on. However, if it is a project under CEQA, you enter the CEQA roadmap. So CEQA considers a project based on several things. So anything that is considered a discretionary activity, meaning that the agency would have to actually review it quite extensively before they could say yes or no, is going to be considered a project under CEQA. Any action that is proposed or being implemented by a public agency is a project under CEQA. Any private development that requires the approval or a permit from a public agency becomes a project under CEQA. And anything that uses public funds becomes a project under CEQA. So for the TNTFMP program, generally the reason why CEQA is being triggered for this funding stream is because it utilizes public funds from CAL FIRE, and it requires, in certain situations, it may also require a permit from a public agency to proceed. So once you've determined that you do in fact have a project under CEQA, the next thing the agency tries to determine is this project ministerial? And now that's essentially the end of this process, or is it discretionary and further review has to happen? So discretionary, like I said, it's any time when the agency really needs to exercise judgment before they can approve or issue a permit or approve or disapprove the project. When we think about those things, a good example would be a grading permit. They need to review that to make sure that you're not going to be doing extensive environmental damage before you get issued that permit. Versus what is considered a ministerial action, where the permit that you need is a check the box situation. So maybe you're just changing out the electrical in your kitchen. That would be a check the box situation, a ministerial action, and there's no further analysis required under CEQA. Now, with this program, the majority of these projects are going to fall in the discretionary category. So once you've determined that it's a discretionary action and needs additional review, the next step is to determine, is it exempt from CEQA or not? If it's exempt from CEQA, you can go through the exemption route and essentially you prepare a more distilled down document, and you don't have to prepare an environmental impact report. But if it isn't exempt from CEQA, then there needs to be further analysis on the potential impact a project could have. So with CEQA, there are three main types of exemptions that could be utilized for a project. One is called a general exemption, and this basically means there's no possible way that your project could impact the environment in it at all, and this really isn't used. This is incredibly rare. The next one would be what's known as a statutory exemption, so technically a ministerial project, or what's also known as an emergency project. So if a state of emergency has been declared at a local, federal, or state level, then sometimes these environmental permitting processes can be waived in those scenarios, but there has to be an official declaration of an emergency. And then the final one is called categorical. So this is generally when the action you're bringing forth is really well documented and really well known. So we can essentially predict what the environmental impact will be very easily. And so essentially the agency has a really good understanding of that impact and then feels comfortable moving you through that streamlined process. Now, each agency has their own list on what they consider a categorical exemption. So CAL FIRE isn't going to make categorical exemptions about watershed health. And then this also generally is where a lot of fuels reduction work tends to fall into this particular stream. So if you did qualify for an exemption and the lead agency helps you figure this out, what the next step that happens essentially is they issue a notice of exemption and you've completed your CEQA process, and now they can decide if they're going to approve or disapprove your project. So basically a notice of exemption explains the exemption your project qualified for, provides reasoning as to why it qualifies for that exemption, and just really justifies that action. But what's really important to note is that it legally can be challenged and it must be publicly posted. And if a challenge is issued that basically says this project doesn't qualify for an exemption after all, then your project goes back into the CEQA process. So let's say maybe you had to go back into the CEQA process, or your project didn't actually qualify for an exemption. The next step is to prepare an initial study. So an initial study helps the agency decide if your project needs to now be preparing an environmental impact report or an EIR or a negative declaration. Essentially, what it's trying to do is understand what are the potential impacts the project could have on the environment, and then how robust does the following analysis need to be. You have to provide some supporting evidence. It's going to be more extensive than a categorical exemption in terms of the evidence you need to bring forth, but less than an EIR. So this just gives you an idea of what an initial study looks at. So you basically have to describe the project. You have to establish the environmental setting, so the environment you're going to modify, and then where your project is, and then answer the checklists for essentially each one of the categories what is known as Appendix G. And there are many categories that you have to look at, ranging from aesthetics to wildfire. And with each one, they have multiple subcategories underneath them. And you have to basically say, is the project going to have a potentially significant impact, a less than significant impact with mitigation, a less than significant impact, or no impact for that category? And what we're trying to understand is, does your project have an action that would result in the impact crossing what is known as the threshold of significance? So the threshold of significance really is an important concept when we try to determine if the project has an impact to the environment. So it's an identifiable quantitative or qualitative environmental effect. And we know all projects affect the environment. Everything we do in life affects the environment, but not every effect is going to be significant. And we think of the threshold of significance as this point of no return. Once you cross it, whatever your action did, what the consequences were, aren't reversible. So if you look at the picture on the slide, the one on the arrow on the left stays below the threshold of significance. This means that the impact to the environment isn't permanent, it wasn't lasting. Versus the one on the right, it crossed that point of no return. And so now the environment has been modified in a way it may not be able to ever recover from. Another thing that's really important when we look at the threshold of significance is CEQA only looks at the physical environment. It does not consider economic or social changes. Those are not considered significant effects on the environment. So let's say the initial study determined that every single aspect of your project had no impact on the environment. You can then prepare what's known as a negative declaration, and that would be your final CEQA document. So a negative declaration, like I said, it's when the initial study concludes that all of those environmental impacts stayed below the threshold of significance. They were the arrow on the left. And this becomes the end of your CEQA process. Now, what's important to note is that you have to be able to supply what is known as a fair argument to justify your reasoning, which basically means you must have substantial evidence and a reasonable inference that that is going to be the result, that no impact is the result. And again, this can be challenged. And if it does get challenged successfully, you go back into the CEQA process again. So let's say that the initial study found that maybe your project does have some potentially significant environmental impacts, but they can be mitigated. Something can be done in advance or after the action to essentially prevent the damage or repair the damage to the environment. Then you can go through what's known as a mitigated negative declaration or a mitigated neg dec. So when you prepare a mitigated negative declaration, what the initial study found was that something had the potential to impact the environment and go past the threshold of significance. However, there was an action that could be undertaken where now that arrow would go back down below the threshold of significance and the environment wouldn't be permanently modified. There is a couple of things though with that is that whatever that mitigation measure is, the applicant has to agree to it in order for it to essentially qualify for this process. So the agency could identify a mitigated measure that would in fact drop that arrow back down below the threshold of significance. But if the applicant refuses to implement that measure, then they can't use this process because now that impact is no longer being mitigated. This can be a really time-saving and cost-saving way to move through the more extensive sides of CEQA. But again, you have to find mitigation that's going to work. You have to support it with evidence that it would work, and it's enforceable. So if you don't follow the mitigation measure, you can now put your project in jeopardy. And the other piece is that, again, it does have a certain risk for litigation. And if you are successfully challenged under this, again, you could go back into that CEQA process and start over. So if your initial study determines your project has an environmental impact, then you have to prepare the EIR. So an EIR has to be prepared when any single piece of your project has an impact on the environment. It doesn't matter if it was only one question that triggered the potentially significant impact or 10. As long as one of those answers is the project has a potentially significant impact on the environment, an EIR has been triggered. EIRs are pretty extensive and they're pretty robust in their analysis. They really dive into exactly how the project is modifying the environment and what is being done to potentially reduce that. And they're really used to give the agency an idea of what they could potentially be approving. Essentially, the process is a draft is prepared. It goes out for public review. Some of you may have even participated in this process. And then the final EIR is prepared after the public review period. It is a legally binding document. It lasts forever. So, you could be the 10th owner on a house, on a piece of land. And if that particular house has an EIR that was attached to it that maybe stipulated you couldn't build within 100 feet of a river, that stays there. And that applies to you too, even though you weren't the original project owner. So once you've gotten your final piece of CEQA, the last step is essentially what's called the notice of determination. And this is where the agency now decides if they're going to move forward with the project or not. What the notice of determination does is it discloses the CEQA process you went through, the environmental impacts that your project may or may not have, any conditions of approval that were agreed upon, or mitigation measures by the applicant. And then if there is an impact that will still result in a modification to the environment, the agency has to then also justify why they're going to proceed on the project or not. And then if they do proceed on the project, they have to provide what's called a statement of overriding considerations. This is publicly filed with the Office of Research and Planning, and all of the documents that are in the CEQA process become public facing. So the biggest thing to sort of understand with CEQA is, one, it is a complex process. That we do know. It's difficult even for agencies to move through it sometimes, but it's a necessary process. We can't skirt around it. We can't pretend it's not there. We have to go through it. So we just have to find the best ways to make it work for us. The other thing is, with this particular program, public funds are in play, and so they will trigger CEQA. And as Susie mentioned, if you choose not to utilize public funds and you only use private funds, you're less likely to trigger this particular process. But because this is a publicly funded grant program, you do trigger CEQA automatically. You can't start your project until CEQA is completed and you have project approval. That's a really, really big no-no in the CEQA world, and you can get in really big trouble if it's ever found out that you started a project before you got CEQA approval. And the other thing is, reach out to your potential lead agencies in advance. Engage them early and often. They can help guide you and help you figure out if you have a project that's even viable for CEQA, maybe what kind of CEQA documentation you would need, and really give you an idea of what you're looking at with regards to CEQA. And that's really what they're there for. So I really encourage you to reach out to your planning offices to just get an idea of what you could potentially be looking at in regards to CEQA. And so the last piece too, if you are applying for grant funding, you do want to consider the cost factor that is associated with CEQA. Because you are the applicant, you will be required to fund it. And that is all I have for you today with regards to CEQA, and Anne will share some more resources that the Office of Emergency Services published earlier this year through our virtual office hours program.
Thanks so much, Alessandra. Just before we jump into the question and answer session with our presenters, I want to just note, as Alessandra just said, there's a number of resources that exist in our region, specific to our region, but also available statewide. And I can share out more links to these ones that I have specifically listed here on our website. as well as some additional resources that I'm familiar with and that TTCF is familiar with. But noting just kind of the ones that we've highlighted and discussed thus far tonight, the Truckee North Tahoe Forest Management Program that is being administered by TTCF. As Susie mentioned, the Forest Stewardship Workshop series that she presents and coordinates during. Those are statewide and have cohorts all over the state. I am currently participating in the Santa Cruz and Santa Clara County ones, but she will just put in the chat some more information about those workshops. As Alessandra mentioned, Nevada County Office of Emergency Services has done a number of different workshop series that they call their office hours on CEQA, as well as other forest health and wildfire prevention related topics that we can share out. Many of you may be familiar with the Measure T Community Wildfire Prevention Grant Program that is specific for those that reside or own property within Truckee Fire Protection District. Something that we're excited to announce, TTCF through our Forest Futures grant making just funded Placer County through their Defensible Space Pilot Program to expand what was a pilot program that mostly targeted Western Placer County to actually expand into Eastern Placer County. And so that will be providing grant opportunities for property owners within Eastern Placer County to actually conduct defensible space up to $5,000 per property, which is really exciting. And then additionally, there's tons of other programs around the state, such as the California Forest Improvement Program, which is another cost-share program through CAL FIRE. But with that, I want to jump into our questions. So if you have any questions come up, please feel free to either put them in the chat and I can read them out, or if you'd like to ask your own question, you can either raise your hand or say that you have a question and unmute yourself and chime in. We definitely love to have an engaged audience. It looks like Gnome chimed in with one question already. Does the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation fund CEQA compliance? Who is considered the lead agency? What is the most common method for CEQA compliance on TTCF funded projects? Where does TTCF receive funds? So a lot of different questions in there. I'll answer some and then allow Alessandra to also jump in and fill in some of those other CEQA specific questions. So TTCF, through that Truckee North Tahoe Forest Management Program, we do fund technical assistance to go through the CEQA compliance process. And those funds would be utilized to hire a registered professional forester to help you go through that process. However, as part of that process, you would still need to identify a lead agency along with your registered professional forester, because the lead agency does still need to be a part of that process, even though those grant funds would be paying for the registered professional forester specifically. And TTCF for that particular program, we have received those funds from CAL FIRE. So as Alessandra alluded to, Alessandra actually serves on the steering committee for that grant program. And so she has helped us understand what all goes into our CEQA compliance process with this. And it's because that we have funding from CAL FIRE, which is the California State Department of Forestry and Fire Prevention, that automatically triggers the CEQA process for any projects that are applied for through this grant program specifically. So Alessandra, I'll turn it over to you. And if there's anything else you want to fill in about the lead agency.
Yeah,
side.
so generally a lead agency is going to be whatever agency has jurisdiction. And so if we're thinking about the Truckee Tahoe area, those are your counties, your fire districts, in certain cases, cities or the town. Sometimes it can also be like sanitation districts, but generally a lead agency is a public agency that has jurisdiction and authority to issue a permit or move through the CEQA process. So typically in Nevada County, the county will be its own lead agency or be the lead agency. And so really you just have to kind of approach the lead agency and see who, what, if they have capacity to take the project on, how can they help you? And I believe also with the program, we do provide a list of potential lead agencies, but ultimately it is up to the lead agency's discretion if they want to take your project on and become the lead agency and move you through the CEQA process. So to your second or third question, what is the most common method for CEQA compliance for TTCF funded projects? So I can't speak to exactly how TTCF, the projects that were funded last time, went through CEQA. And honestly, there's really no common method because it's specific to each project. ultimately the nature of your project determines what type of CEQA compliance you have to go through. And so even though maybe categorical exemptions are a really common way for fuels reduction work to be qualified under CEQA, that isn't always the case. For example, in Western Nevada County, typically that is the method that the county uses to move through the CEQA process. But we have some projects that are really complex with their impacts to biological resources, archaeological resources, and it's very unlikely that we would be able to move through the categorical exemption process because of that. So it's extremely project specific, and the lead agency helps you figure that out as well.
If I could just kind of clarify on my question, can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. I was wondering because, you know, what we're describing here is really just forest management and not like, let's say, development or something like that. So there's a lot of programmatic, like CFIP, you know, they use a programmatic EIR, something like that would be very applicable to this kind of funded work. And what I'm hearing you describe is kind of like the typical CEQA compliance for any project very broadly under the sun. I was wondering if you guys ever focus that with CAL FIRE, since you're getting funding through them, you know, I don't know exactly what would be the best method. If you're not getting CFIP funds, then you can't use their programmatic EIR. But yeah.
So
okay. Sorry,
what you could still use CFIP. So CFIP requires that you have a forest management plan. So you could use the TNTFMP program to get a forest management plan and take it to CFIP. Getting a forest management plan by itself doesn't trigger CEQA. CEQA is triggered for implementation.
Correct.
Or the other, so you're also talking about CalVTP. So to be honest, the majority of projects that are moving through the CEQA world right now don't utilize CalVTP. It does favor a certain type of project, and it's pretty complex to actually prepare and not as streamlined as one would hope.
Exactly.
And generally the most streamlined process is a categorical exemption. But again, it's super project specific. So it's not easy to just say you could do one way or another, because it's just going to really depend on what you're applying for. And then how are you also planning on using the management plan? Like I said, you could exit the TNTFMP stream afterwards and just use it for your own private funds, or use it to move through CFIP.
Gotcha. I guess specifically what I'm curious about is if the TTCF funds the CEQA compliance and then the actual work, what you're saying is that we have to identify the lead agency that would be responsible for permitting the CEQA or for managing the CEQA document or permitting. Is that correct?
That is taken into consideration when we evaluate applications that come into the TNTFMP program. So whether you have identified a lead agency and you have one, or you've had the conversation, or you haven't at all, then we'll kind of do some digging to see if there is a suitable lead agency. But it is definitely a consideration in whether you would be awarded funding, because obviously we don't want to award funding if there isn't a feasible lead agency for the project.
Okay. Yeah.
And I would say too, if you're interested in applying for funding from the TNTFMP in this next round, to reach out to Anne or myself to start the conversation around CEQA lead agency, if that's where your property is at and that's what you think you'd be requesting funding for.
Good. Okay, thank you.
And I'll just add to that as well. If anyone has questions about lead agency or lead agencies, or don't know who to reach out to, or don't know who to contact, that is something that we didn't do in this last round as explicitly, but we're really trying to focus on in the upcoming round with prospective applicants and hosting office hours, and also just continuing to make ourselves available. My email will be available if anyone has questions about lead agencies that are best suited given wherever their property is. And so that's something that we can also engage with you on, Gnome, if you're interested in applying for the program but don't know who to reach out to or where to start in that process. I'll just add Dylan Sheedy, who is with Truckee Fire, also added to to your question, Noam, that the most common is a 15304 exemption, which is a minor alteration to land. And Eric Hornfent, also with Truckee Fire, added some comments in the chat for you, Noam, so feel free to read those. I'll address our next question. Someone had asked about more information on the private owner defensible space program through Placer County. I will note that funding decision was made last week by the TTCF board. So that's a very new funding decision, and more information will be coming out about that program, I imagine sometime late winter, early spring. Nicole, do you have more specifics on the timeline with that?
Not on the timeline, but I can just give a little bit more context into the program. So first, I'm going to paste a link to Placer County started this defensible space program actually, I think last year. And so the link that I'm providing is to the program they already have established. The new funding that we just awarded specific to Eastern Placer County is going to have a little bit different eligibility requirements than what you will see on the link on this page. So one of the key differences is that their original program, you had to be very low income designated or senior or disabled. And really that eligibility didn't apply to very many residents in Eastern Placer County. So the Eastern Placer County specific program that will be started next year is going to have a little bit different eligibility restrictions. I think they're going to be targeting low income, and they're going to do an assessment of how many residents that could serve in Eastern Placer County. And if that qualification doesn't serve enough residents in Eastern Placer County, then they will open up that qualification even more. But right now it's going to start at the low income level. You'll see the table on their website. And then as they do their research on how many people that would actually make eligible in the region, they'll decide if they're going to open that up even more. So more to come on that, but I just wanted to put that link there so you could at least look at how they did it in the previous years.
Great, thanks for that, Nicole. Another question that had come in from James was surrounding just engagement of registered professional foresters. And Susie, you had shared a link to the CAL FIRE website with the registry of RPFs. I just would ask Susie, do you have any advice to folks on reaching out to registered professional foresters, or the best way to engage folks in starting that forest management plan process if they're not going to go through the stewardship class?
Yeah, so word of mouth is often the best way to find a forester. Do you know other people in your area who've done projects? If foresters are professional, like a doctor or a lawyer, you want to find one that fits with you and your goals, and can help you implement your vision. And so just asking friends, people in the community who've worked with RPFs. If you have an RPF, you could ask them for references of people they've worked with and hear from them about how happy they are with the results. I know foresters are really busy during the season. It sounds like James started in January. That's often a time when people are in the office, but all summer long, they're typically very busy out there on the landscape. So I would just try at different times of year in order to try and catch them when they're in the office. I know that we don't have enough RPFs in the state. In our area, it's really not that bad as compared to other parts of the state. For example, San Bernardino has 1 RPF, and I think they just made it to 2 recently. So a lot of parts of the states are very underserved by this profession. But around here, I would say keep trying, try at different times of the year. And I do see a couple RPFs on the webinar. So if Andrea or Ryan want to type in the chat box their suggestions, I think that would be fabulous.
Thanks for that, Susie. I think Andrea had dropped off a little bit earlier, but definitely appreciated her joining this evening. I will be cognizant of our time. It is 5:30. So if there are any last minute questions, feel free to drop those in the chat and I can follow up with our presenters and make sure that we get an answer to you to make sure that no one has any current burning questions. But as you saw, Nicole tossed back up on the screen some upcoming events that TTCF is hosting. On Wednesday, November 29th, we'll be hosting another of our Forest Features Salon series on prescribed fire, what, why, and how. We've had a lot of prescribed fire this season, and so thought it'd be great to engage the community and answer any questions they might have around that. And then additionally, on Tuesday, January 9th, with the opening of our next application round for the Truckee North Tahoe Forest Management Program, we will have an application workshop to walk folks through the eligibility requirements as well as the application platform. So please, I'll put our website to link to both of those in the chat, as well as include them in the follow-up email with the recording of this. But thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate Alessandra and Susie sharing their knowledge with us, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next salon. Have a great evening. Bye.